The iron bars pressed cold against Ayana's shoulders as another stone struck her cheek, drawing blood that mixed with the dust caking her bronze skin. She made the cramped cage look smaller than it was, her 6'2" frame folded into a space meant for livestock, not a human being. The crowd outside jeered and pointed, their faces twisted with disgust and fear as they stared at the woman they called a savage, a killer, a beast that needed to be caged for their safety. This was Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878. The town square baked under a merciless sun that turned the metal cage into an oven, cooking her slowly, while good Christian folk paid 2 cents to throw vegetables, rocks, or insults at the Apache woman who had murdered a white officer. The sign above her cage, painted in crude red letters, declared her crime for all to see. Murderess, Indian squaw, killer of Lieutenant William Hargrove, property of the United States Army. But the sign didn't tell the whole truth. Signs never did. Step right up and see the savage widow, called out Carson Miller, the Army sergeant, who collected admission fees and kept order around the cage. See the red demon who killed one of our finest soldiers in cold blood. Watch her and remember what happens when we show mercy to her kind. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to block out the lies, tried to return to the quiet place in her mind where she could still hear her grandmother's voice singing the old songs. But the quiet place was getting harder to find with each passing day. 3 years in this cage had worn it down to almost nothing, like water slowly eroding stone until only dust remained. She hadn't crushed Lieutenant Hargrove's skull like they claimed. She hadn't torn him apart with her bare hands or scalped him while he screamed for mercy. The truth was simpler and somehow worse. William Hargrove had been drunk that night, as he was most nights, his breath reeking of whiskey and violence, as he stumbled into the small adobe room where Ayana was forced to sleep. He called it their marriage bed, though no Apache ceremony had blessed their union, only a mockery of white man's law performed at gunpoint after the raid on her village. The night he died, Hargrove hadn't come for her. He'd come for Nayeli, Ayana's 12-year-old sister, the only family she had left after the soldiers destroyed their home near Sierra Blanca. She could still see her baby sister's terrified face, still hear her screaming as Hargrove's hands reached for her, still feel the surge of protective rage that made Ayana move without thinking. One punch, that's all it took. One desperate strike to save her sister from a monster in a blue uniform. Hargrove stumbled backward, his boots catching on the edge of the stone fireplace. The sound of his skull cracking against the corner still haunted her dreams 3 years later. She hadn't meant to kill him, only to stop him, but intention meant nothing when an Apache woman raised her hand against a white officer. Nayeli had died anyway, just 1 month after Hargrove. The same smallpox epidemic that swept through the detention camp took her little sister along, with 43 other Apache prisoners. Ayana had held Nayeli's burning body through the final night, singing the death songs their grandmother taught them, songs that were now forbidden by Army regulation. When dawn came and her sister's spirit had fled, Ayana walked to the fort commander's office and surrendered herself, hands bound with rope she'd tied herself. She'd expected them to hang her, wanted them to truth be told. Death would have been a mercy compared to the hollowness that filled her chest where her heart used to beat. But the Army had other plans. They decided she would serve as an example, a warning to any Apache who might think about resisting the civilizing hand of American progress. So they built this cage in the center of Santa Rosa and put her in it, like an animal in a traveling show, charging admission to fund the local militia. A little girl pressed her face between the adult's legs, now staring up at Ayana with wide brown eyes. Unlike the others, she wasn't afraid. She was curious. The child reminded Ayana of Itzlai, her own daughter, who had been 5 years old when the soldiers came to Sierra Blanca. Little Itzli, who had looked at her mother with that same innocent wonder, who had believed her mama was strong enough to protect her from anything. Mama. Why is the lady so sad? The little girl whispered to her mother. The woman jerked her daughter away as if Ayanna carried plague. "Don't look at that thing, Sarah. It's not natural. Indians aren't like us. They're closer to animals than people." The word thing hit harder than any stone. Ayanna had been called every cruel name imaginable over the past 3 years. Savage beast killer, squaw red demon. But somehow being called a thing, being stripped of even the basic recognition of her humanity, made something crack inside her chest. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and the crowd began to thin as people returned to their shops and homes, their entertainment concluded for the day. Soon, only a few stragglers remained, teenage boys looking for mischief, and one drunk who'd passed out on a bench across the square. And one other figure. He stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a sun-worn fence post near the general store. A tall man in worn rancher's clothes, his hat pulled low over his eyes so she couldn't see his face clearly. But unlike everyone else who had stared at her over the past 3 years, he wasn't laughing or pointing or throwing things. He was just watching with a stillness that made Ayanna's stomach flutter with an emotion she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope was dangerous for someone like her. Hope was what made you believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might see past the cage and the crimes and the color of your skin to find the broken woman underneath. Hope was what got you hurt worse than any beating ever could. The man pushed off from the fence and started walking toward her cage. Ayanna's hands gripped the bars so tightly her knuckles went white beneath her bronze skin. Whatever he wanted, it couldn't be good. In her experience, men who approached her cage after the crowds dispersed always had the worst intentions. Some came to proposition her with vile offers. Others came to spit on her or describe in detail what they'd like to do to an Indian woman who couldn't fight back. She straightened her spine and met his approach with her head held high. If he'd come to degrade her, she'd at least deny him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. The man stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that she could see him clearly now. He looked to be in his late 30s, with the time-beaten face of someone who'd spent his life working under the sun. Silver threads ran through his dark hair and deep lines framed his eyes. His clothes were clean, but worn the kind of honest wear that came from hard work rather than poverty. Working man's hands, she noticed, scarred and calloused, but somehow gentle, as they rested at his sides. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with the same respect he might show a lady stepping out of a fine carriage. Ayanna blinked in surprise. No one had called her ma'am in 3 years. She'd been called every vile name in English and Spanish, and even a few in Apache that the soldiers had learned specifically to insult her, but never something that suggested she was still human, still worthy of basic courtesy. "You hungry?" he asked, reaching into his coat pocket. Her stomach clenched at the word. Sergeant Miller fed her scraps twice a day, barely enough to keep her alive, but not enough to give her strength to resist. She nodded slightly, not trusting her voice, not sure this wasn't some new form of cruelty disguised as kindness. The man pulled out a cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully, revealing thick slices of bread, cheese, and dried beef. Real food. Good food. The kind of meal she used to prepare for her family, back when she had a family, back before the world turned to ash and iron. "My name's Thomas Brennan," he said, breaking off a piece of bread and sliding it through the bars. "Most folks call me Tom." His fingers brushed hers as she took it, and she flinched from the unexpected gentleness of human touch that didn't hurt. She stared at the bread in her massive hand, afraid it might disappear if she looked away. When was the last time someone had given her something without expecting degradation in return? "What's your name?" Tom asked. "Your real name, not whatever they wrote on that sign." "Ayanna," she whispered the word, feeling strange on her lips. She'd almost forgotten she had a real name, that she'd once been a person with an identity beyond prisoner and killer and thing. "That's a beautiful name," Tom said, and the way he said it with genuine warmth in his voice made her want to believe him. "What does it mean?" "Eternal blossom," she replied, then laughed bitterly. My grandmother named me that because I was born during the spring when the desert flowers covered the hills. She said I would bloom forever. She gestured at the cage around her, at the filth and the chains, and the hatred. Some blossom. Tom's expression didn't change, didn't fill with pity or disgust or any of the reactions she'd learned to expect from white faces. He just continued passing food through the bars, watching as she ate with the desperation of someone who never knew when the next meal might come. "You don't belong in there," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. The square had emptied as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, leaving only lengthening shadows and the evening sounds of a town settling into supper time. "Yes, I do," Ayanna replied, her voice hollow. "I'm a killer. I'm dangerous. I murdered a United States Army officer." Tom studied her face in the fading light, his eyes moving from the scars on her wrists where the shackles had worn permanent marks to the way she held the bread with such care as if it might break. "That's not what I see when I look at you." "Then you're blind," she said flatly. "Or stupid, maybe both." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've been called worse." He leaned back himself on an overturned crate someone had left near the cage, making it clear he intended to stay a while. "Tell me what happened. The real story, not the one they tell in the saloons." Ayanna felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous loosening of the walls she'd built to survive. "Why do you care? What do you want from me?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he watched the sun paint the adobe buildings in shades of gold and crimson. "I had a sister once, Lydia. She was born with a twisted spine that made her walk different from other children. Kids used to throw rocks at her on the way to church, called her a cripple, and worse things. Adults would cross the street rather than look at her like her difference was contagious. She died when she was 16, never knowing what it felt like to be seen as a person instead of a burden." His voice carried old pain, a wound that had healed but still ached in certain weather. "After Lydia died, I swore that if I ever met someone who was hurting the way she hurt, I'd try to show them kindness, real kindness, with no strings attached, no expectations. Just one human being acknowledging another." Ayanna stared at him, searching his worn face for signs of deception, for the hook hidden in the bait. But she found only sincerity, and somehow that terrified her more than cruelty ever could. "I've been watching you for 3 days," Tom continued. "Saw how you saved water from your cup to give to that bird that built its nest in the corner of your cage. Saw how you sang quietly to yourself at night when you thought no one could hear. Saw how you closed your eyes when they brought that little girl close, like you couldn't bear to see another child looking at you with fear." Ayanna's breath caught. She hadn't realized anyone could hear her singing the old songs, the lullabies her grandmother had taught her, the ones she used to sing to Itzli before the world ended. The thought of this stranger listening to her most private grief felt like being stripped naked in front of the jeering crowd. "A woman who sings lullabies to herself isn't a killer," Tom said softly. "She's just someone who's forgotten how to hope." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Ayanna felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough in this cage. Cried for Nayeli, for Itzli, for her grandmother, and her village, and everyone she'd lost. She had no tears left for herself. "You want to know what happened," she said finally, her voice hard as flint. "Fine, I'll tell you. But don't expect some story that makes you feel better about the world. There's no comfort in truth." Tom nodded and settled himself more comfortably on his crate, prepared to listen for as long as it took. Ayanna took a deep breath and began speaking words she'd never said aloud, before testimony she'd been forbidden to give at her trial, truth that no one had cared to hear. 4 years ago, my village was near Sierra Blanca. We'd signed treaties, stayed in the areas your government assigned us. We weren't raiding, weren't fighting. We were just trying to survive on land that grew smaller every season. She paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. November of 1874. The soldiers came at dawn. They said we were harboring renegades, said they had orders to relocate us to the reservation at San Carlos. My husband had died the winter before from the coughing sickness your people brought, so it was just me, my daughter Itzli, my sister Nayeli, and my grandmother. Tom's expression remained neutral, but she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The soldiers were burning everything. Ayanna continued, her voice taking on the flat quality of someone recounting a nightmare they'd lived through too many times. They said it was to prevent us from returning, but I think they just liked watching things burn. My grandmother was too old to walk fast. She told me to run with the children, save them. So I did. I ran. She stopped, closing her eyes against the memory of looking back to see her grandmother's tent collapsing in flames, knowing the old woman was still inside, too weak to escape. We made it to the rocks at the canyon edge. I thought we were safe. But Lieutenant Hargrove found us. Her hands clenched around the bars until her knuckles turned white. He was young then, maybe 25. Handsome in the way your people measure such things. He looked at me and my daughter and my sister, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood turn cold. Not anger or duty or even hatred, hunger. Tom's hands had curled into fists, but he remained silent, letting her speak. He took us as prisoners, Ayanna said. But that's not the right word for what we became. Property is closer to the truth. The Army transferred us to Fort Marcy, put us in the detention camp with other Apache families they'd captured. Hargrove visited our tent often, always at night, always drunk. He said I was his now, said Apache women belonged to whoever was strong enough to take them. She felt the old fury rising in her chest, hot and bitter as bile. After 6 months, he decided he wanted to make it legal, wanted a proper white marriage so no one could question his right to me. The fort chaplain performed the ceremony with Hargrove's pistol pressed against my spine. My sister cried through the whole thing. She was only 9 years old, and she understood what was happening better than that chaplain did. Tom's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with suppressed emotion. "Where was your daughter during all this?" Ayanna's eyes snapped open, fixing him with a gaze that held all the grief of the world. Itzli was already dead by then. She died in the fire at Sierra Blanca. I couldn't save her. I ran, but not fast enough. When I looked back, she was gone. 5 years old, and she burned because I wasn't strong enough to carry both children and my grandmother. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Tom said nothing, but she saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "So yes," Ayanna continued, her voice gaining strength from anger, "I was Hargrove's wife by white man's law. I lived in his quarters. I cooked his meals and washed his clothes and endured his attentions when he was drunk enough to want them. And every night I dreamed of killing him. Every single night for 3 years. She leaned closer to the bars, her face illuminated by the last rays of sunset painting the sky crimson. But when I finally did it, when I finally raised my hand against him, it wasn't for me. It was for Nayeli. He came home drunk that night, drunker than usual. I thought he'd just pass out like he usually did, but he went to her bed instead of mine. Started pulling at her blanket, saying she was old enough now, saying it was time she learned what her sister already knew. Tom's knuckles had gone white, where they gripped his knees, but his voice remained steady. "So you stopped him." "I hit him once," Ayanna said simply. "Just once. Not with a weapon, not with killing intent, just with my fist, the same way I'd hit men who tried to steal horses back when I was free. But Hargrove was drunk and his balance was bad. He fell backward into the fireplace. I heard his skull crack. I heard him stop breathing. And I felt nothing. No regret, no horror, nothing." She laughed, a sound without humor. "They found me sitting beside his body the next morning, still covered in his blood. I didn't run, didn't try to hide. What would have been the point? They were always going to punish me for being Apache. At least this way, I'd actually done something to deserve it." Tom was silent for a long time after she finished speaking. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night, and Ayanna felt a pang of longing for the wild places where her people used to roam free. "Did you mean to kill him?" Tom asked finally. The simple question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before. The judge, the army tribunal, the crowds who came to gawk at her, they all assumed that someone her size, someone with her strength and her savage blood, must have killed on purpose. The idea that it could have been an accident, that she might have been defending her child sister rather than seeking revenge, had never occurred to any of them. "No," she whispered, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "I never meant to kill anyone. I just wanted to save my sister. But I couldn't save her either. She died of smallpox 1 month later in the detention camp. So I killed a man for nothing." The tears came then despite all her resolve. They rolled down her cheeks in the darkness, silent and unstoppable years of grief finally finding release. She turned her face away from Tom, ashamed of her weakness, but he reached through the bars and did something that shocked her to her core. He gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was so tender, so completely unexpected, that Ayanna froze. No one had touched her with kindness since her sister died. Every hand that reached for her came with cruelty or lust or violence, but Tom's touch carried only compassion. "My wife died 2 years back," he said softly, his hand still resting against the bars near her face. "Fever took her, same as it took a lot of folks that winter. Anna was her name. She was small and pretty and everything this town would call perfect. But she married me for my land, not for who I was. We lived together for 6 years, and I don't think she ever really saw me. I was just the man who owned the property she wanted." He pulled his hand back slowly, respecting her space. "When she died, I thought I'd never want to marry again. Thought I was done trying to make someone happy who could never be happy. But then I saw you 3 days ago, and I realized something." Ayanna looked at him through tear-blurred eyes. "What?" "That sometimes the strongest people are the ones who've been broken the most. That sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is keep surviving when the world wants them dead. And that sometimes kindness isn't about fixing someone. It's just about bearing witness to their pain and saying, 'I see you. You're not invisible. You matter.'" The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She wanted to reject them, to push him away before his kindness could hurt her worse than any hatred. But she was so tired of being alone with her grief, so exhausted from carrying all this pain with no one to share the weight. They sat in companionable silence as night fell completely over Santa Rosa. Tom didn't leave when the town lights dimmed and the streets emptied. He just stayed there beside her cage, a quiet presence in the darkness. When she began to sing softly in Apache the old lullabies that had haunted her for years, he didn't ask her to stop or demand translation. He simply listened, bearing witness to her sorrow without trying to fix it or explain it away. Hours passed. The moon rose full and bright, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Ayanna felt something shifting inside her, some ice that had frozen around her heart, beginning to crack. "Tom," she said, finally breaking the long silence, "why are you really here? Men don't sit beside cages in the middle of the night just to be kind. What do you want from me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured, like he was weighing each one before releasing it into the world. 4 years ago, I was in the cavalry, Company C, 3rd Regiment. We did a lot of things I'm not proud of. Followed orders that shouldn't have been given, hurt people who didn't deserve hurting." Ayanna's breath caught. She knew where this was going, could feel the terrible truth building like a storm on the horizon. "November 1874. Tom continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "My unit was ordered to clear out an Apache village near Sierra Blanca. They said the village was harboring renegades, that we needed to relocate them to San Carlos for their own safety. We rode in at dawn. No, Ayanna breathed, pressing herself against the back of the cage. "I was the one who torched the chief's tent," Tom said, and his voice cracked with the weight of confession. Captain Morrison handed me the torch and pointed to the biggest tent in the village. Said the chief was hiding inside, said we needed to smoke him out. But when I threw that torch through the opening, I heard screaming. Not a man's voice. Children. Ayanna's world tilted sideways. She gripped the bars to keep from falling as Tom's words reshaped reality into something even more nightmarish than before. I tried to pull the tent down, tried to get them out. Tom continued, and she could hear tears in his voice now. But the fire spread too fast, canvas and dried grass and old wood all going up like kindling. By the time we got the flames out, there were 3 bodies inside, an old woman and 2 children, a boy maybe 7 years old and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. Ayanna couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world had narrowed to Tom's voice and the terrible truth it carried. What month? She demanded, her voice rising. Tom, what month in November? The 15th, he whispered. November 15th, 1874. Ayanna released a sound that was part scream, part howl, a noise of such raw anguish that it echoed across the empty square. She threw herself against the bars with enough force to make the entire cage shudder, her hands reaching through to grab at Tom, even though he was too far away to touch. That was my village, she screamed in Apache, then again in English. That was my grandmother. That was my daughter. You burned my Itzli alive. Tom didn't move, didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He just knelt there in the dirt, letting her rage wash over him like he deserved every bit of it. I didn't know, he said, and the helplessness in his voice was almost worse than the confession itself. I swear to you, Ayanna, I didn't know there were children inside. If I could take it back, if I could trade my life for theirs, I would do it without hesitation. She wanted to kill him, wanted to reach through these bars and tear him apart with her bare hands, make him feel a fraction of the pain she'd carried for 4 years. But the bars held firm, and all she could do was collapse to her knees, sobbing with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. Why, she gasped between sobs. Why did you come here? Why tell me this? Just to torture me more. Tom's voice, when it came, was broken but steady. Because you deserve to know the truth. Because I've been carrying this for 4 years, and when I saw you in this cage 3 days ago, I recognized you. Not your face, but your eyes. You have the same eyes as that little girl I pulled from the fire, the same shape, the same color, and I knew that tent I burned had been yours. He moved closer to the bars, close enough that she could have struck him if she'd wanted to. I came here because I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. I took your daughter from you. I destroyed your family. And I've spent 4 years trying to drink away the memory and pretend I'm not a murderer, just like they say you are. The anger drained out of Ayanna as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. You killed my baby girl, she said, her voice empty of emotion. You burned her alive, and now you sit here feeding me bread and calling me ma'am, and acting like kindness can balance those scales. It can't. Tom agreed simply. Nothing can. But I'm going to try anyway, because it's all I have left to offer. They stayed like that for a long time on opposite sides of the bars that separated killer from killer, victim from victim. The moon tracked slowly across the sky, indifferent to human suffering, marking the passage of hours neither of them could take back. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, Tom stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold ground all night. I'm going to buy your freedom, he said. It's not forgiveness. It's not redemption. It's just a debt being paid. Ayanna looked up at him with eyes red from crying. And then what? You think setting me free will bring Itzli back? You think opening this cage will make us even? No, Tom said. We'll never be even. But at least you'll be free to hate me from somewhere other than a cage. At least you'll have a choice about whether to forgive me or spend the rest of your life planning how to make me pay. He turned to leave, then paused. I'll be back tomorrow with the money. And, Ayanna, for what it's worth, I am so sorry, more sorry than I have words to say. He walked away into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Ayanna alone with the weight of truth that changed everything and nothing. She had a name now for the man who'd killed her daughter, a face to attach to 4 years of formless rage, and somehow impossibly that man wanted to set her free. She laughed then, a sound brittle as breaking glass. Freedom. As if such a thing existed for someone like her. As if iron bars were the only cage that could hold a broken woman. As if knowing the truth about Itzley's death would do anything except make the wound bleed fresh again. The sun rose over Santa Rosa, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and pink. Another day beginning. Another day surviving. And now, if Tom Brennan kept his word, perhaps her last day in this particular hell. But Ayanna knew the truth that Tom was still learning. Some cages you carried with you no matter where you went. Some prisons were built from grief and guilt and memories that refused to fade. Setting her body free wouldn't touch the bars around her heart. Still, as the town began to wake and the first curious faces appeared to stare at the savage in the square, Ayanna found herself wondering what freedom might taste like after 3 years of captivity. Found herself imagining a world where she could walk away from this cage, this town, this man who'd destroyed her family, and then offered her bread and tears and confession. The wondering felt dangerous. It felt like hope, and hope she'd learned long ago was the cruelest cage of all, but she wondered anyway. Tom didn't return the next day, or the day after that. 3 days passed with Ayanna watching the square from her cage, searching every face that appeared for the rancher who'd confessed to killing her daughter. Each sunset brought a fresh wave of bitter vindication. Of course he hadn't come back. White men's promises were worth less than the breath it took to speak them. He'd gotten what he wanted, unburdened himself of guilt by confessing to a woman who couldn't do anything about it, and now he was gone. Good, she told herself, as she lay on the filthy straw that served as her bed. Better to know the truth about people than to waste energy hoping they might be different. But on the 4th night, just as the last light was fading from the sky, she heard the familiar sound of boots on hard-packed dirt. Tom appeared at the edge of the square, moving slowly like a man walking to his own execution. He carried a leather satchel that bulged with weight, and his face looked like he hadn't slept since their last conversation. He stopped a few feet from the cage, close enough to talk, but far enough to give her space. "I'm sorry I took so long. Had to sell off part of my herd to raise the money. 500 head of cattle. Took 3 days to find buyers willing to pay cash." Ayanna pushed herself up from the straw, her massive frame unfolding like a predator rising. 500 cattle, she said flatly. "That's your whole operation." "Most of it," Tom admitted. "Enough to keep the ranch running, but I'll be starting over from almost nothing." She studied him through the bars, trying to understand what kind of madness drove a man to destroy his livelihood for a woman who had every reason to want him dead. Why? Tom's laugh was short and humorless. "You already know why. Because I owe you more than cattle, more than money, more than anything I could ever give you." Ayanna moved closer to the bars, her dark eyes boring into his. "You think buying me makes us even? You think gold can pay for my daughter's life?" "No," Tom said simply, "but it can buy your freedom. And freedom is the only thing I have to offer." Before Ayanna could respond, a new voice cut through the evening air. Touching scene, really. Almost makes me want to cry. Sheriff Daniels emerged from the shadows near the general store, his deputy trailing behind him. The lawman's hand rested on his gun belt in that casual way men adopted when they wanted you to remember they had the power to kill you legally. Tom turned to face them, his posture shifting subtly into something more defensive. "Evening, Sheriff? Just conducting some business." "Business," Daniels repeated, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That's what we're calling it now. Looked to me like you were about to do something real stupid, Brennan, like trying to free a convicted murderer." "She was never convicted," Tom said, his voice level but hard. "There was no trial. The Army tribunal didn't allow her to speak in her own defense, didn't call witnesses, didn't follow any legal procedure. They just locked her up and threw away the key." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You calling the United States Army unjust? I'm saying that what happened to Ayanna wasn't justice. It was revenge." Daniels laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Boy, you've gone soft in the head if you think anyone in this territory cares about justice for a squaw who killed a white officer. You know who Lieutenant Hargrove's mother is. Eleanor Hargrove of the Boston Hargroves. That family's got more money than God and twice the influence." "What does that have to do with anything?" Tom asked, though Ayanna could hear in his voice that he already suspected the answer. "It means," Daniels said slowly, like he was explaining something to a child, "that the Hargrove family paid this town a substantial sum to ensure their son's killer received appropriate punishment. It means that if certain people in Santa Rosa were to suddenly decide that appropriate punishment should end, the Hargroves might decide to sue this entire territory for failing to uphold justice." Tom's jaw tightened. "How much did they pay you, Sheriff?" Daniels's hand moved closer to his gun. "Watch yourself, Brennan. That's sounding awful close to an accusation." "It's a question," Tom replied, "but I notice you're not denying it." For a long moment the two men stared at each other while Ayanna watched from her cage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd seen situations like this before, knew how quickly masculine pride could turn to violence when witnesses were scarce and darkness provided cover. The deputy broke the tension by clearing his throat nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should just let Mr. Brennan go home. He hasn't actually done anything wrong yet." Daniel's eyes never left Tom's face, yet being the operative word. "But you're right, Curtis. We should let Mr. Brennan go home and think real carefully about what kind of future he wants. Because I'd hate to see his ranch meet with some unfortunate accident. Dry season like this, fires can start real easy." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tom's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not afraid of you, Sheriff." "Then you're a fool," Daniel said. He turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and Brennan. That Apache woman in there, she killed one white man already. You really think she won't kill another if you give her the chance? Sleep on that before you do something stupid with your cattle money." The sheriff and his deputy disappeared into the darkness, leaving Tom standing alone in the square. He stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger. Ayanna finally spoke, her voice quiet. "You should listen to him, take your money, and go home. I'm not worth dying for." Tom turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see something fierce and unbreakable in his expression. "That's not your decision to make." She shook her head. "You're a fool, Tom Brennan, a fool with a death wish and more guilt than sense." Maybe he agreed, but I'm a fool who keeps his promises. He lifted the leather satchel. "This is $5,000 in gold and banknotes. It's everything I have left after selling the cattle. Tomorrow morning, I'm taking it to the Army quartermaster at Fort Marcy. I'm going to buy your contract of detention." Ayanna's breath caught. "The Army will never agree to that. They will if the price is right," Tom said, "and if I make it clear that I'm taking legal responsibility for you, that I'll guarantee your good behavior and ensure you never return to cause trouble." She moved to the bars, gripping them so tightly her knuckles went white. "And then what? Even if they agree, even if you somehow manage to buy my freedom, what happens next? You think the sheriff will just let you walk out of here with the woman who killed a Hargrove?" Tom's smile was grim. "That's where things get interesting. See, I've spent the last 3 days doing more than selling cattle. I've also been asking questions, talking to people who were at Fort Marcy the night Hargrove died, people who saw things but were too afraid to speak up. What kind of things, Ayanna asked, though part of her was afraid to hope. Things like your sister's body having marks on her that the Army doctor noted in his report but didn't include in the tribunal record. Things like 3 other soldiers reporting that Hargrove had been disciplined twice before for inappropriate conduct with female prisoners. Things like the chaplain who performed your forced marriage telling his wife he didn't think it was legal or right, but he was ordered to do it anyway." Ayanna felt something unfurling in her chest, something dangerous and painful. "Evidence," she whispered. "You found evidence. Not enough to overturn anything," Tom admitted. but enough to make certain people nervous if it became public knowledge. Enough to make the Army want to settle this quietly rather than face questions about how they let an officer brutalize Apache women under their watch. He pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I found a lawyer in Albuquerque willing to file a petition. He says if we can get you released from military custody into civilian custody, we might be able to argue for a review of your case. It's a long shot, but it's something." Ayanna stared at the paper like it might bite her. "Why are you doing this? You already told me the truth about Itzley. You already confessed your crime. Why not just walk away?" Tom's expression was steady, unflinching. "Because confession isn't the same as redemption. Because knowing I'm guilty doesn't change anything unless I try to make it right. And because you deserve better than dying in this cage." She wanted to reject his help, wanted to tell him that nothing he did could ever balance the scales between them. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of the cage and the hatred and the slow erosion of her humanity. Tired of waking up each day with nothing to hope for, except maybe dying in her sleep. "If you do this," she said slowly, "if you somehow manage to buy my freedom, I won't forgive you. Not for Itzley. Not ever." "I know," Tom said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to let me try." Before Ayanna could respond, a new sound cut through the night. Running footsteps, small and quick, followed by heavy breathing. A child's voice called out in the darkness, "Miss Ayanna, Miss Apache lady." A boy appeared at the edge of the square, maybe 10 years old, clutching a book to his chest like it was made of gold. He skidded to a stop when he saw Tom, clearly not expecting anyone else to be there. "Samuel," Tom said, recognizing the boy. "What are you doing out here? It's past dark." The boy, Samuel, looked between Tom and Ayanna nervously. "I needed to talk to the Apache lady. It's important." Ayanna knelt down in her cage so she was closer to the boy's eye level. "I remember you. You're the blacksmith's son. You watched them put me in here 3 years ago." Samuel nodded, his eyes wide. "I was 7 then. My pa brought me to see you when they first locked you up. He said I should look at you and remember what happens to savages who forget their place." Ayanna felt the familiar sting of those words, but the boy wasn't finished. "But I didn't believe him." Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength, "because I saw what really happened that night, the night Lieutenant Hargrove died." Tom straightened, suddenly alert. "What do you mean you saw?" Samuel opened the book he was carrying, and Ayanna realized it wasn't a book at all, but a sketch pad filled with drawings. "My ma says I spend too much time drawing instead of working. But I like to sit in the shadows and sketch people. That night I was in the alley behind Lieutenant Hargrove's quarters. I couldn't sleep, so I was drawing the moon." He flipped through the pages with shaking hands until he found what he was looking for. "And I saw this." He held up the sketch pad, angling it so the moonlight fell across the page. Ayanna's breath caught. The drawing was crude but clear enough. It showed a little girl cowering on a bed, a large man looming over her, and a woman's figure in the doorway with her fist raised. Samuel had captured the moment just before she struck Hargrove, the moment when her sister's terrified face had pushed her past fear and caution into desperate action. "I drew it exactly how I saw it," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "The lieutenant was trying to hurt that little girl. You were protecting her. It wasn't murder. It was saving someone." Tom took the sketch pad with careful hands, studying the drawing like it was a holy relic. "Samuel, why didn't you tell anyone about this? Why didn't you show this to the tribunal?" The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I tried. I told my pa what I saw, and he beat me for lying. Said Indians weren't worth losing his business over. Said if I told anyone the Army would run us out of town for defending a savage." He looked at Ayanna through the bars, his young face etched with guilt. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I was scared. But I kept the drawings. I kept them because I thought maybe someday someone would want to know the truth." Ayanna reached through the bars and Samuel didn't flinch away. She rested her large hand on his small shoulder, feeling him tremble under her touch. You were 7 years old, a child. You don't apologize to me. You understand. But you've been in here for 3 years, Samuel protested. 3 years because nobody would tell the truth. Sometimes truth isn't enough, Ayanna said gently. Sometimes the world doesn't want to hear it. Tom was still studying the drawings, flipping through page after page. Samuel had documented more than just that one night. He'd sketched Hargrove dragging Ayanna through the fort, sketched him striking her when she moved too slowly, sketched the way other soldiers looked away when it happened. "This changes everything," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "Samuel, can I take these? Can I show them to the lawyer in Albuquerque?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Take them. Use them. Just please help Miss Ayanna. She doesn't deserve to be in there." As Samuel ran back home, disappearing into the darkness, Tom turned to Ayanna with something like hope flickering in his eyes. "This is it. This is the evidence we needed. A witness account from a child who had no reason to lie." Ayanna shook her head slowly. "It's a drawing by a 10-year-old boy, the son of a blacksmith with no standing in this community. They'll dismiss it." Maybe, Tom admitted, but maybe not. And even if the Army dismisses it, the territorial governor might not. Especially not if these drawings become public and people start asking questions about why a child's testimony was ignored. "You're talking about stirring up a hornet's nest," Ayanna said. "The Hargrove family won't take this lying down. The sheriff will come after you. You could lose everything." "I already lost everything that mattered when I threw that torch into your grandmother's tent," Tom said quietly. "This is just money and property. It's not worth protecting if it means letting you rot in this cage." The conviction in his voice made something crack in Ayanna's chest, some wall she'd built to protect herself from caring about anything or anyone. Against her better judgment, against all her survival instincts screaming at her to push him away before he got close enough to hurt her worse than anyone already had, she found herself wanting to believe him. "What happens if you succeed?" she asked. "If you somehow buy my freedom and get me out of here, what then? You think I'll just marry you out of gratitude, play house on your ranch while the whole territory talks about the fool who took a savage for a wife?" Tom's smile was sad. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Ayanna. I'm asking you to let me help you get free. What you do after that is your choice entirely." She studied his face, searching for deception, for the angle she was sure existed somewhere in his offer. But all she saw was weary honesty and bone-deep guilt that would never fully heal, no matter what he did. "Why marriage then?" she pressed. "Why offer that specifically?" "Because it's the only way to get you legal protection under territorial law," Tom explained. "If you're released from military custody, but you're not under someone's legal guardianship, you'll be classified as a vagrant. They can arrest you, relocate you to the reservation, or worse. But if you're married to a white citizen with property, you have rights. Limited rights, but better than none." "So it's a business arrangement," Ayanna said. "It's a way to keep you alive and free," Tom corrected. "The rest is up to you." Before Ayanna could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the square. Multiple horses approaching fast. Tom's hand went instinctively to his belt, but he wasn't wearing a gun. The riders emerged from the darkness, a dozen men with torches that cast dancing shadows across the adobe buildings. At their head rode Mayor Whitman, his round face flushed with anger and whiskey. Behind him came several of the town's prominent citizens' men Ayanna recognized from their visits to throw stones and insults at her cage. Brennan Mayor Whitman bellowed, his voice slurred but loud. "Step away from that cage. You're under arrest for conspiracy to free a military prisoner." Tom stood his ground. "On whose authority?" "My authority as mayor of this town and acting marshal in the absence of proper law enforcement," Whitman declared. "Sheriff Daniels informed me of your intentions. We can't allow you to release that savage back into civilized society." Ayanna felt her stomach drop. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with her freed, but with Tom arrested or killed, and her left to rot in this cage until she finally stopped breathing. But Tom didn't move. He crossed his arms and met the mayor's gaze with calm defiance. "Last I checked, Mayors don't have the authority to override federal military contracts. If the Army agrees to release Miss Ayanna into my custody, that's a legal transaction you have no power to prevent. We'll see about that, Whitman snarled. He gestured to two men behind him. Grab him. And somebody get Sergeant Miller. We're moving the prisoner to the fort tonight before Brennan can cause any more trouble. As the men dismounted and moved toward Tom, Ayanna made a decision that surprised even herself. She slammed her fists against the bars of her cage, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. You want to arrest someone, arrest me. I'm the killer. I'm the savage. Tom Brennan hasn't done anything except show basic human decency. The mayor's eyes swiveled to her, gleaming with malice in the torchlight. Oh, we're not arresting you, squaw. We're just making sure you stay exactly where you belong until we can ship you off to San Carlos Reservation, where you can't corrupt any more weak-minded fools. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching men and Ayanna's cage. You're making a mistake, Mayor. I have documentation. I have witness statements. I have evidence that Ayanna killed Hargrove in defense of a child. If you move her now, if you prevent a legal review of her case, you'll be interfering with territorial justice. The only justice that matters is white man's justice, one of the men growled. And white man's justice says Indians who kill white folk get punished. Even when the white folk deserved it, Tom shot back. The square erupted into chaos, men shouting, horses neighing, torches waving. In the midst of it all, Ayanna watched Tom stand alone against a dozen angry men, defending a woman he barely knew. A woman whose child he'd killed, a woman who'd made it clear she would never forgive him. It was the most insane thing she'd ever witnessed, and somehow against all logic and self-preservation, it made her want to fight. She gripped the bars of her cage and pulled with all her considerable strength. The iron creaked, but held. Years of being fed barely enough to survive had weakened her, but rage and desperation flooded her muscles with power she'd thought was gone forever. "Stop!" she roared in Apache, then in English. "All of you stop this madness." The violence of her voice cut through the chaos. Even the horses went still. Ayanna pressed her face between the bars, her dark eyes blazing in the torchlight. You want to know what kind of man Tom Brennan is. He's the man who burned my village, who killed my daughter, who destroyed my family and my life. He told me this himself 4 days ago, confessed his crime knowing I had every reason to want him dead. The crowd murmured in confusion. Tom stood frozen, clearly not expecting her to reveal this. "And you know what he's doing now?" Ayanna continued, her voice rising. "He's trying to make it right. Not because he thinks he can erase what he did, not because he expects forgiveness, but because he's the only one of you with enough honor to admit when he's done wrong and try to fix it." She turned her gaze to Mayor Whitman. "You talk about justice, about civilized society, but what justice locks a woman in a cage without trial? What civilization lets a child's testimony be ignored because he was defending the wrong kind of person?" "Samuel's drawings," Tom said quietly. "He showed up while you were busy gathering your mob, a witness to what really happened the night Hargrove died." Whitman's face went pale. "The boy is lying. Children make things up. Then you won't mind if we let a judge decide that Tom said, let's take this to territorial court. Let's put all the evidence in front of an impartial jury and see what they say." "There won't be any judge," Whitman sputtered. "There won't be any court. That woman is Army property, and she stays in that cage until they say otherwise." Actually, a new voice cut through the tension that's not quite accurate. The crowd turned to see an elderly woman stepping out of an expensive carriage that had appeared at the edge of the square. She was dressed in black silk despite the heat, her white hair pinned up in an elaborate style. 2 armed men flanked her, their hands resting on holstered pistols. Ayanna's blood ran cold. She knew that face from wanted posters and descriptions. Eleanor Hargrove, the dead lieutenant's mother. Mrs. Hargrove, Mayor Whitman stammered, clearly not expecting her. "Ma'am, we were just handling the situation with your son's killer. Were you?" Eleanor Hargrove said, her voice cold and refined. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're threatening to arrest a man for attempting to purchase a military detention contract, which is, as I understand it, perfectly legal. She moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water, men parting before her wealth and status. She stopped in front of Tom, studying him with eyes as sharp as broken glass. "You're Thomas Brennan, the one who's been asking questions about my son." "Yes, ma'am," Tom said, meeting her gaze without flinching. Eleanor turned to look at Ayanna in her cage, and Ayanna braced herself for the hatred she was sure would come. But the old woman's expression was unreadable. "My son wrote letters home," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Letters about his service, his duties, his life on the frontier. In the last year before he died, those letters changed. He started writing about things that made me uncomfortable. About how he treated the Apache women in the detention camp. About privileges he felt entitled to take. The crowd had gone completely silent now, hanging on every word. I burned those letters," Eleanor continued. "Burned them because I didn't want to believe my son could be capable of such things. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting I'd failed as a mother. But burning letters doesn't erase truth, does it?" She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope sealed with red wax. "This is a deposition, written by my son's commanding officer at Fort Marcy, a man I paid considerable money to remain silent for 3 years. He describes in detail the complaints made against my son by other soldiers, the reports of his conduct with female prisoners, the warnings he was given that went ignored." Eleanor held up the envelope, her hand trembling slightly. "I'm giving this to the territorial governor tomorrow morning, along with a formal request that the case against Ayanna be reviewed by civilian authorities rather than military tribunal." Mayor Whitman's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "But, ma'am, your son, he was murdered." "My son was a monster," Eleanor said, her voice breaking for the first time, "and I enabled his monstrosity by pretending it didn't exist. But I'm dying, gentlemen. Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months at most. I won't meet my Maker with this sin on my soul." She turned to Ayanna, and this time there were tears in the old woman's eyes. "I can't give you back the years you've lost. I can't undo what my son did to you or what these men did by locking you away without justice. But I can tell the truth, and I can try to set things right before I go." Ayanna stared at the woman whose son had destroyed her life, whose money had kept her caged, whose influence had silenced any voice raised in her defense. She waited for rage to fill her, for the desire for vengeance to overwhelm everything else, but all she felt was a deep, exhausted sadness. "Your truth comes 3 years too late," she said quietly. "I know," Eleanor replied, "and I'm sorrier for that than you'll ever know." The old woman turned back to the crowd of men, her spine straightening with aristocratic authority. "I'm withdrawing all financial support from this town effective immediately. No more payments to ensure the prisoner remains detained, no more bribes to keep uncomfortable questions from being asked. And if any harm comes to Mr. Brennan or to Ayanna before this matter can be properly reviewed, I'll use every resource at my disposal to ensure everyone involved faces federal charges." She fixed Mayor Whitman with a look that could have frozen fire. "Am I making myself clear, Mr. Mayor?" Whitman nodded mutely, all his bluster gone. "Good," Eleanor said. She climbed back into her carriage but paused before closing the door. "Mr. Brennan, please come see me tomorrow. We have matters to discuss regarding reparations and legal proceedings." The carriage pulled away, leaving stunned silence in its wake. The mob that had come to prevent Tom from freeing Ayanna now stood uncertain, their righteous anger deflated by the loss of their financial patron and moral authority. One by one they drifted away into the darkness, until only Tom remained standing in the empty square. He turned to Ayanna, and she could see he was shaking. "Did that really just happen?" he asked. "I think so." Ayanna replied, "Though I'm not sure I believe it." Tom laughed, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. He moved to the cage and rested his forehead against the bars. "This doesn't fix everything. You're still locked up. There's still a long road ahead. But it's a road that leads somewhere other than this cage, Ayanna said. That's more than I had yesterday. They stayed like that for a long moment, two damaged people separated by iron and history and crimes that could never be fully atoned for. But for the first time since Tom had appeared in her life, Ayanna felt something other than rage or despair. She felt the dangerous, fragile stirring of hope. Tomorrow morning, Tom said quietly, I'm going to the fort. I'm going to use Eleanor Hargrove's deposition and Samuel's drawings and every legal tool I can find to get you out of here. And when you're free, I'm offering you a choice. What choice? Ayanna asked. You can take the first stage to Mexico. I'll pay for passage and supplies. Help you find your people who fled south. Give you a chance to start over somewhere far from here. Or you can marry me. Not because you forgive me, not because you feel grateful, but because it'll give you legal standing in this territory, protection under the law, a place to heal while you figure out what comes next. And what do you get out of it? Ayanna asked. The chance to spend the rest of my life trying to repay a debt I can never fully settle, Tom said simply. The chance to wake up every day and see living proof that sometimes people deserve second chances even when they don't earn them. Ayanna considered this, turning it over in her mind. It was the strangest proposal she'd ever heard, not offered out of love, but out of guilt, not promising happiness, but offering protection, not asking for her heart, but simply for the opportunity to serve penance. I haven't decided yet, she said finally. Ask me again when I'm standing on free ground instead of locked in a cage. Maybe I'll feel differently when I can walk away if I choose to. That's fair, Tom agreed. He stepped back from the cage, tipping his hat in that respectful way he had. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow changes everything. As he walked away into the darkness, Ayanna settled back onto her pile of straw. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't sing the death songs. She didn't weep for all she'd lost. She simply closed her eyes and let herself imagine a future that extended beyond these bars. It was terrifying. It was impossible. But somehow, against every instinct screaming at her to protect herself from disappointment, she allowed herself to hope. And hope, she was beginning to remember, could be the most dangerous weapon of all. Morning came with the sound of wheels on dirt and voices raised in bureaucratic argument. Ayanna woke to find Tom standing in the square beside an army wagon, papers clutched in one hand, while he gestured emphatically with the other. Across from him stood Sergeant Miller and 2 officers. She didn't recognize their blue uniforms, crisp, despite the early hour. The cage door is Army property, one of the officers was saying, his voice tight with irritation. You can't just purchase a prisoner's release like you're buying a horse. Tom's response was calm but firm. According to Territorial Law Section 47, military detention of non-combatants on civilian land requires either formal charges or a renewable contract with local authorities. Miss Ayanna has never been formally charged with a crime under civilian law, and your detention contract with Santa Rosa expires today. I'm offering to assume financial and legal responsibility for her in exchange for her release into my custody. The officer's face reddened. This is highly irregular. So is holding someone for 3 years without trial, Tom countered. I have documentation from Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove withdrawing her family's complaint. I have witness testimony suggesting the death of Lieutenant Hargrove occurred during defense of a minor, and I have a letter from Judge Morrison in Albuquerque stating his willingness to review this case if it's brought before civilian court. He spread the papers on the wagon bed like cards in a poker game. You can fight me on this and face questions about why the Army held an Apache woman without due process, or you can accept my payment transfer custody and let the territorial courts handle it from here. Your choice, Captain. The officer exchanged glances with his companion, and Ayanna could see them calculating odds and risks. She'd learned to read white men's faces over 3 years of captivity, learned to see the moment when self-interest outweighed principle. How much, the captain asked finally. Tom lifted a leather pouch that clinked heavily with coin. $2,000 in gold, plus another 1,000 in territorial scrip for administrative fees, and paperwork. More than fair compensation for a prisoner you're legally obligated to release anyway once the detention contract expires. The officers huddled together, speaking in low voices. Ayanna watched the negotiation with her heart hammering against her ribs. This was really happening. Tom was actually going to buy her freedom, was going to stand in front of Army officers and bargain for her like she was worth saving. Part of her wanted to scream at him to stop, to save his money, to walk away before he destroyed himself for a woman who could never give him what he needed. But a larger part, the part that had survived 3 years in this cage by sheer stubborn refusal to break, wanted desperately to believe that freedom was possible. The captain turned back to Tom, his expression sour. "We'll need to process the paperwork, file reports with Fort Marcy. This could take weeks, or it could take an hour if you're motivated," Tom said. He added another pouch to the pile. "Consider this motivation." The captain's hand closed over the gold. "1 hour. We'll prepare the transfer documents. But Brennan, if she commits any crime, if she so much as steals a chicken, it's your neck on the line. You understand that?" "I understand," Tom said. As the officers walked away toward the mayor's office where official documents were kept, Tom approached the cage. Ayanna stood to meet him, her tall frame making her eye level with him even through the bars. "You're insane," she said. "You just paid $3,000 for a woman you barely know." "I told you," Tom replied. "I owe you more than money can measure." "You owe me a daughter," Ayanna said, her voice hard. "You owe me a grandmother and a sister and a village full of people who died because men like you followed orders without question. $3,000 doesn't even begin to cover that debt." "I know," Tom said simply. "That's why I'm not stopping here." Before Ayanna could ask what he meant, another figure appeared in the square. Samuel came running, his sketch pad tucked under one arm and his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Brennan." "Miss Ayanna, I heard what's happening. Is it true? Are they really letting you go?" "That's what we're hoping," Tom said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Thanks to your drawings and your courage." Samuel beamed with pride, then turned serious. "My pa found out I came here last night. He whipped me for it. Said I was making trouble where it wasn't wanted." Ayanna felt a surge of protective anger. "Your father struck you because you told the truth." The boy shrugged, trying to act tougher than his 10 years allowed. "He hits me sometimes. It's not so bad. At least this time it was for something that mattered." Tom knelt down to Samuel's level. "Listen to me. What you did took real courage. The kind of courage most grown men never find. Your father is wrong to punish you for having a conscience." Samuel's eyes shone with unshed tears. "He says conscience don't put food on the table. Says the only thing that matters is staying on the right side of powerful people." "Sometimes the powerful people are on the wrong side," Ayanna said quietly. "And it takes children to remind adults what honor looks like." The boy smiled at her through the bars. "When you get out, Miss Ayanna, will you teach me some Apache words? I want to be able to talk to you proper." The request hit Ayanna like a physical blow. In 3 years, no one had asked to learn her language. No one had suggested that Apache words had value or that communication with her was worth the effort. "I would be honored," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel's father appeared at the edge of the square, his face thunderous. "Samuel Briggs, you get away from that cage right now." The boy's shoulders slumped, but he held his ground long enough to say, "I'm glad you're getting free, Miss Ayanna. You deserve it." Then he ran to his father, who grabbed him roughly by the arm and dragged him away. Ayanna watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. That boy had risked his father's anger to speak truth, had kept drawings for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to use them. He'd shown more integrity than most of the adults in this God-forsaken town. Tom stood and returned his attention to the cage. "When they process those papers, when they open this door, you're going to have a choice to make. I need to know you've thought about it." "The choice you offered last night," Ayanna said. "Mexico or marriage?" Tom nodded. "If you choose Mexico, I'll put you on a stage with enough money to start fresh." I'll write letters of introduction to people I know near the border. You'll never have to see me again. And if I choose marriage. Then we go to the courthouse today. We sign papers that make you my legal wife under territorial law. You come to my ranch. And we figure out how two broken people can maybe help each other survive. Ayanna studied his face, searching for hidden agendas for the trap she was certain existed somewhere in his offer. But all she saw was weary sincerity and a bone-deep need for redemption that mirrored her own need for purpose. "Why do you want this?" she asked. "Really, is it just guilt, just debt?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Partly," he admitted. "But also because I've been alone for a long time. My wife died hating me. My sister died thinking no one cared. And when I saw you in this cage, I saw someone who understood that particular kind of loneliness. Someone who knew what it meant to carry weight no one else could see." He reached through the bars, his hand extended palm up in invitation rather than demand. "I'm not asking you to love me, Ayanna. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking if maybe we could be less alone together than we are apart." The honesty of it, the complete absence of romantic pretense, made something shift in Ayanna's chest. This wasn't a fairy tale proposal. This was two damaged people acknowledging their damage and choosing to face it together rather than separately. Before she could answer, the Army officers returned with Mayor Whitman in tow. The mayor looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his face haggard and his movements uncertain. "The paperwork is in order," the captain announced. "Thomas Brennan is hereby granted custody of the prisoner Ayanna, formerly of the Chiricahua Apache Band, pending civilian court review of her case. He's responsible for ensuring she appears at any hearings and for any crime she commits while under his supervision." Tom signed the documents with steady hands. The captain produced a large key and approached the cage. Ayanna stepped back instinctively, suddenly afraid of what freedom might mean. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. The cage door swung wide for the first time in 3 years, and Ayanna stared at the opening like it might be a trap, like stepping through would somehow be worse than staying inside. "You're free to go," the captain said, his voice neutral. Ayanna's legs trembled as she moved toward the door. Her muscles had atrophied from 3 years of confinement, and the simple act of stepping over the threshold felt monumental. She emerged into the morning sunlight, standing on free ground for the first time since they'd locked her away. The world seemed impossibly large. The sky stretched overhead without bars to frame it. The ground beneath her feet was solid dirt instead of cage floor. She could walk in any direction she chose, could run if she wanted to, could simply stand there and breathe air that wasn't filtered through iron. Tom waited patiently, giving her space to process the enormity of the moment. When she finally looked at him, he asked the question again. Mexico or marriage? Ayanna thought about running, about disappearing into the desert, finding her people, starting over somewhere far from this place and these memories. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But safety was an illusion. She'd been safe in her village when the soldiers came. She'd been safe in the detention camp until Hargrove decided otherwise. Safety wasn't something you found. It was something you built, piece by careful piece, with people you could trust to help hold it together. "Marriage," she said. "I choose marriage." Tom's expression didn't change, but she saw relief flicker in his eyes. "Are you sure?" "No," Ayanna admitted. "But I'm more sure of this than I am of anything else." They walked to the courthouse, side by side, Ayanna towering over Tom by nearly half a foot, an odd pair that drew stares and whispers from everyone they passed. Judge Morrison was waiting for them, having been summoned by Eleanor Hargrove's lawyer the night before. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. No flowers, no music, no celebration, just words spoken under law signatures on paper, two people binding their fates together out of necessity and desperate hope rather than love. "Do you, Thomas Brennan, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Morrison intoned. "I do," Tom said. And do you, Ayanna, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband?" Ayanna hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Then she thought of Samuel's courage, of Eleanor Hargrove's deathbed confession, of Tom standing alone against a mob to defend her. She thought of spending one more night in that cage versus taking a chance on something different. "I do," she said. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss. Tom simply offered his hand, and Ayanna shook it like they were business partners rather than newlyweds. In a way they were. This was a transaction designed to keep her alive and give him purpose. Nothing more, nothing less. Tom led her to a wagon waiting outside, helping her up onto the seat with careful courtesy. As they pulled away from Santa Rosa, Ayanna looked back at the town square one last time. The cage still stood there, empty now, but somehow still menacing. A reminder of what she'd survived and what she was leaving behind. The ride to Tom's ranch took them through rolling hills covered in scrub grass and dotted with cattle. The land was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, much like the man sitting beside her. Neither spoke much during the journey, both lost in thoughts too complicated for words. When they crested the final hill, Ayanna got her first look at what was now supposedly her home. The ranch house was modest, a low adobe structure with a covered porch and windows that reflected the afternoon sun. Beyond it stretched corrals and a weathered barn, and in the distance cattle grazed peacefully in the golden light. "It's not much," Tom said, echoing words he'd spoken before. "About 200 acres of grazing land, small house, barn that's seen better days. But it's quiet, peaceful, good for people who want to be left alone." Ayanna climbed down from the wagon, her legs still shaky from 3 years of disuse. She walked slowly toward the house, taking in details. The garden that someone had tended with obvious care. The rocking chair on the porch. The way the land rolled away in all directions, offering views of emptiness that felt like freedom. "I should warn you," Tom said, following her. "The house wasn't built for someone your size. Doorways might be tight. You'll have to duck in some places. I can make modifications, build things to fit you better." The thoughtfulness of his concern touched something deep inside her. He wasn't expecting her to shrink herself to fit his world. He was planning to reshape his world to accommodate hers. "I'm used to making do," she said. 3 years in a cage teaches you how to fit into small spaces." "You won't have to make do anymore," Tom said firmly. "This is your home now, Ayanna. We'll make it work for both of us." He showed her inside, and Ayanna had to duck through the doorway, as he'd warned. The interior was clean and simple, furnished with handmade furniture that showed signs of careful maintenance. Everything was smaller than she was used to, built for people of average size, but somehow it felt more welcoming than threatening. "You'll have your own room," Tom said, gesturing to a door off the main living area. "I know this is a marriage of necessity, not romance. I won't presume on your privacy." The offer of separate sleeping arrangements should have relieved her. Instead, it made her feel oddly disappointed, though she couldn't have explained why. "Thank you," she said simply. Tom showed her the kitchen, the root cellar, the well behind the house. He explained his daily routine, where things were kept, how the ranch operated. He spoke to her like an equal partner rather than a subordinate, asking her opinion on things, making it clear her input mattered. As the sun began to set, Tom prepared supper. Simple fair beans and cornbread and coffee, but he served it on real plates at a real table, treating her like a guest rather than a burden. They ate in silence, both uncertain how to navigate this strange new reality they'd created. Ayanna kept catching herself glancing at the door, half expecting someone to burst in and drag her back to the cage. Freedom felt too fragile to trust. "You're safe here," Tom said quietly, reading her anxiety. "No one's coming for you, I promise." "You can't promise that," Ayanna said. "The army could change their minds. The Hargrove family could decide Eleanor's confession wasn't enough. Sheriff Daniels could." Tom reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The touch was gentle grounding. "Listen to me. I've spent $3,000, sold most of my cattle, and put my reputation on the line for this. I'm not letting anyone take you back to that cage. Not the army, not the sheriff, not anyone. You understand?" The fierce protectiveness in his voice made tears prick at Ayanna's eyes. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand between her and harm. Forgotten what it meant to matter enough that someone would fight for her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing all this?" Tom's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Because 4 years ago I held a torch that killed your daughter. And I can't bring her back, can't undo that moment. But I can make sure her mother survives. I can make sure you get to live the life that Itzley never got to have." The mention of her daughter's name broke something open inside Ayanna. She pulled her hand away and stood abruptly, needing space, needing air. Tom didn't follow as she walked outside onto the porch. The desert night had fallen stars scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Ayanna tilted her head back and found the constellations her grandmother had taught her, the ones that told the old stories of her people. She sang softly in Apache, the words flowing out before she could stop them, a lullaby she used to sing to Itzley, a song about a little bird who flew too close to the sun. She didn't hear Tom approach until he spoke from the doorway. "That's beautiful. What does it mean?" Ayanna turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "It means that some losses are too great to survive, that some griefs don't heal, that loving something makes you vulnerable to pain you can't imagine until it happens." Tom stepped onto the porch, maintaining respectful distance. "Is that why you're afraid? Because you're worried about caring again?" "I'm afraid because every time I've cared about someone, they've been taken from me," Ayanna said. "My husband died of disease. My daughter burned in a fire. My sister died of smallpox. My grandmother died because I ran instead of staying to save her. Everyone I've ever loved has died, and I'm still here, still surviving when I have no right to." The guilt in her voice was a mirror of Tom's own. They stood on opposite sides of the porch, two people drowning in different oceans of remorse. "I know what it's like to survive when you shouldn't," Tom said quietly. "To wake up every morning wondering why you're still breathing when better people are dead. But Ayanna, punishing yourself doesn't honor the dead. It just makes their deaths mean less." "How dare you," Ayanna snarled, rounding on him. "How dare you tell me what honors my daughter? You killed her. You don't get to have opinions about what her death means." "You're right," Tom said, not backing down, but not arguing either. "I don't. But I know that if I had died in that village instead of surviving, if Apache warriors had killed me that day, I wouldn't want my sister to spend the rest of her life in a cage of guilt. I'd want her to live, to find something worth surviving for." Ayanna wanted to rage at him, wanted to channel all her pain into anger, because anger was easier than grief. But she was so tired of being angry, so exhausted from 3 years of fury that had nowhere to go except inward. She sank down onto the porch steps, her tall frame folding into itself. "I don't know how to live anymore. Don't know how to be anything except a prisoner or a survivor or a victim. Don't know who Ayanna is when she's not defined by what's been taken from her." Tom sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "Then maybe we figure it out together. Maybe we both learn how to be something other than our worst moments." They sat in silence as the night deepened around them, two broken people trying to believe that broken things could be mended. The peace lasted exactly 4 days. Ayanna woke on the 5th morning of her freedom to the sound of horses approaching fast. She dressed quickly and emerged from her room to find Tom already at the window, his rifle in hand. "How many?" she asked. 10, maybe 12, Tom said grimly, coming from town. "This isn't a social visit." Ayanna looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. She recognized some of the riders: Mayor Whitman, Sheriff Daniels, several of the men who'd been part of the mob at her cage. They rode with purpose weapons, visible torches ready despite the morning light. "They're coming for me," Ayanna said. Someone changed their mind about letting me go free. Tom's jaw set in a hard line. Over my dead body. That's probably what they're planning, Ayanna said. She moved to the gun cabinet and pulled out a shotgun, checking to see if it was loaded. Her hands remembered the weight and balance of weapons from her youth, from the days before white law made it illegal for Apache women to carry guns. "You know how to use that?" Tom asked. "My father taught me to hunt before your people decided hunting was a crime," Ayanna replied. She pumped the shotgun, the mechanical sound loud in the quiet house. "I'm not going back in a cage, Tom. I'd rather die fighting." "Won't come to that," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. The riders pulled up in front of the house, surrounding it in a loose semicircle. Mayor Whitman dismounted, flanked by Sheriff Daniels and 6 armed men. 2 stayed on horseback, watching the approaches. Brennan Whitman called out, "Send the squaw out. We're taking her back to territorial custody." Tom stepped onto the porch rifle, held loosely but ready. "On what grounds, Mayor?" "I have legal custody, papers signed by Army officers and witnessed by a federal judge." "Those papers are being contested," Whitman said. "The Hargrove family back east, Eleanor's cousins, they're challenging her deathbed confession, saying she wasn't in her right mind, saying the confession was obtained under duress." "She gave that confession of her own free will," Tom said. "There were witnesses who were paid," Sheriff Daniels chimed in. "The cousins are arguing that you and that Indian corrupted a dying old woman to get what you wanted. They've filed new charges. Murder, conspiracy, manipulation of a witness. Those charges are fabricated," Tom said. "Maybe," Whitman replied. "But until a judge says otherwise, we're authorized to take the prisoner back into custody pending a hearing." "She's my wife," Tom said. "Not a prisoner. And you're not taking her anywhere." The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Brennan. You're outnumbered and outgunned." Inside the house, Ayanna listened to the exchange with growing dread. This was it. This was the moment when Tom's protection wouldn't be enough, when white man's law would prove itself as fickle and unreliable as she'd always known it to be. She could run, could slip out the back while they were focused on the front, could disappear into the desert and make for Mexico like she should have done in the first place. Tom would probably survive if she wasn't here to fight over. They'd arrest him, maybe fine him for helping her escape, but they wouldn't kill him. It would be the smart choice, the practical choice. But as Ayanna stood there gripping the shotgun, she realized she was tired of making the smart choice, tired of running, tired of letting other people decide her fate while she hid in shadows. She kicked open the front door and stepped onto the porch beside Tom, the shotgun leveled at the men below. "You want me?" she called out in a voice that carried across the yard. "Come and take me, but I promise you I won't go quietly. Not this time." The sight of her, tall and armed and absolutely unafraid, sent a visible ripple through the men. Some hands moved toward weapons. Others held steady, uncertain. "Miss Ayanna," Mayor Whitman said, trying for a reasonable tone, "nobody wants anyone to get hurt. Just come peaceful and let the courts sort this out." "The courts had 3 years to sort it out," Ayanna shot back. "They chose to lock me in a cage instead. Why should I trust them now?" "Because this time you'll have proper representation," a new voice called out. Everyone turned to see a carriage approaching from the opposite direction, driven hard and fast. It pulled up at the edge of the property, and 2 people climbed out. Samuel, the blacksmith's son, his face bruised but determined, and beside him, dressed in traveling clothes and leaning heavily on a cane, Eleanor Hargrove. "Mrs. Hargrove," Sheriff Daniels stammered. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here. You're not well." "I'm dying," Eleanor corrected sharply. "That's different from incapacitated. And I'm well enough to inform you that any attempt to arrest this woman will be met with a lawsuit the likes of which this territory has never seen." She moved forward with Samuel's help, her steps slow but purposeful. "My cousins may be contesting my confession, but they're doing so from Boston while I'm standing here in front of witnesses. I'm of sound mind, not under duress, and I'm prepared to testify in any court of law that my son was a monster who deserved what he got. The mayor's face reddened. "Mrs. Hargrove, your family's lawyers can go to hell," Eleanor finished. "Along with anyone who tries to put this woman back in a cage for defending a child from rape." The blunt language shocked everyone into silence. Ladies of Eleanor's class didn't use such words, didn't speak plainly about such things. "I've spent 3 years being polite," Eleanor continued. "Being proper. Being the grieving mother who defended her son's honor, even though she knew he had none. I'm done with that. I'm dying, and I'm going to spend my last months telling the truth, even if it burns down my family's reputation." She turned to Ayanna, her eyes fierce despite her frail body. "You saved your sister from a fate worse than death. The law should have thanked you, not imprisoned you. And I will make sure the whole territory knows it." A distant sound cut through the moment. More horses approaching, but from a different direction. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons until the riders came into view. It was a group of Apache men, maybe 20 of them heavily armed and painted for war. They surrounded the ranch in a wider perimeter, creating a second ring around the white men who'd come to arrest Ayanna. At their head rode a man Ayanna recognized despite 4 years of absence. Nietzsche, son of Cochise, one of the last free Apache warriors still resisting reservation life. The riders stopped creating a tense standoff. Nietzsche dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and proud. He walked toward the porch where Ayanna stood, his eyes never leaving her face. "We heard a daughter of the people was held captive in this place," he said in Apache. "We came to offer justice." Ayanna answered in the same language, relief and fear mixing in her chest. "Brother, I am grateful, but this is not the time for war." Nietzsche's eyes swept over the white men assessing threats. "If they try to cage you again, it becomes the time for war." Tom couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He lowered his rifle slowly, making no threatening moves. "Tell him we don't want violence," he said to Ayanna. "Tell him I'll protect you with my life if necessary." Ayanna translated, and Nietzsche's eyes narrowed as he studied Tom. "This is the white man you married, the one who burned your village." "Yes," Ayanna said. "And you trust him?" She hesitated, then realized the answer was yes. Against all logic, against every survival instinct, she did trust Tom Brennan. "I do." Nietzsche was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, switching to English. "The Apache people have long memories. We remember every broken treaty, every murdered child, every village burned. We remember Sierra Blanca." He fixed Tom with a stare that could cut stone. "You were there, white man. I recognize you from the battle. You held a torch that killed our people." Tom didn't deny it. "I did. And I will carry that shame until the day I die." "Shame is easy," Nietzsche said. "Action is hard. What have you done to earn the right to stand beside her?" Tom's voice was steady. "I've given everything I have to buy her freedom. I've married her to give her legal protection, and I'll die before I let anyone cage her again." "Pretty words," Nietzsche said. "Let's see if you mean them." He made a gesture, and his warriors raised their weapons, aiming at the white men who'd come to arrest Ayanna. "Now we have balance," he said. "Your people threaten to take her. My people threaten to stop you. Someone will die today unless wiser choices are made." The Mexican standoff stretched tight as a bowstring. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and blood would paint the desert red. "Stop," Ayanna said, stepping forward. "All of you stop this madness." She walked down from the porch, moving into the open space between Apache warriors and white lawmen. "I've lost enough family to white man's violence. I won't be responsible for more Apache blood spilled on my account." She turned to Nietzsche. "Brother, I honor your courage in coming here, but I don't need rescue. I need time. Time to let these white people's laws play out. Time to see if maybe this one-time justice might actually happen." "And if it doesn't," Nietzsche asked. "If they cage you again." "Then I'll break free myself," Ayanna said, "or die trying. But not today. Today I choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world can change." She turned to face Mayor Whitman and the sheriff. "You want to arrest me? Fine. Take me to your court. Let me stand before a real judge with real lawyers and real evidence. Let's see if your justice system actually works when someone bothers to use it properly." Whitman looked uncertain, glancing between the Apache warriors and Eleanor Hargrove's determined face. Mrs. Hargrove seized the moment. "I will personally fund Ayanna's defense. The best lawyers money can buy. A jury trial if she wants it, everything done by the letter of the law. And if this territory's justice system fails her again, I'll take it to federal court in Washington itself." The sheriff cleared his throat. "There's procedure for this. Can't just have trials whenever rich ladies demand them." "Then follow your procedure," Eleanor said coldly. "File your charges. Set your dates. We'll be ready." She looked at Ayanna with something like respect. "You're braver than I ever was, child. Braver than my son deserved." Ayanna's voice cut through the standoff one final time. "In Apache law, when you wrong someone, you don't just apologize. You serve. You restore what was taken." She turned to Mayor Whitman. "You want me to disappear quietly? Then you work my land for 6 months, tend the animals, fix the fences, prove that you understand the value of the freedom you tried to steal from me." Whitman's face went purple. "I'm the mayor I don't take orders from someone you caged without trial," Ayanna finished. "Then refuse. Let's see how the territorial governor likes hearing that you'd rather face federal charges than honest labor." The mayor looked around desperately, but found no allies. Even Sheriff Daniels stepped back, unwilling to risk his career for Whitman's pride. 6 months, Whitman muttered. "Then you're gone." 6 months, Ayanna agreed. "Then we'll see who's still standing." The tension slowly drained from the scene as it became clear no blood would be shed today. The white men backed down first, unwilling to risk a firefight with Apache warriors. They rode away, making threats about court dates and proper custody, but they rode away. Naiche watched them go, then turned back to Ayanna. "You've grown strong in captivity, sister, stronger than the bars that held you. Prison either breaks you or makes you iron," Ayanna replied. "I chose iron." The Apache warriors melted back into the desert as quickly as they'd appeared, ghosts of a dying way of life. But before he left, Naiche handed Ayanna something, a knife small but wickedly sharp with a handle carved from bone. "For the next time someone tries to cage you," he said, "don't wait for white man's justice, make your own." Then he was gone, and Ayanna was left standing in her yard with Tom beside her and Eleanor Hargrove watching from her carriage. "Well," Eleanor said with a slight smile, "that was dramatic, but effective. Nobody's going to try arresting you again without thinking twice." She climbed back into her carriage with Samuel's help. "The hearing is set for 3 weeks from today in Albuquerque. I'll have lawyers meet with you before then. We'll build a case so airtight they'd have to be blind to convict you." As the carriage pulled away, Tom and Ayanna stood together in the sudden silence. Samuel remained behind, looking uncertain. "My pa kicked me out," the boy said quietly. "Found out I helped Mrs. Hargrove come here, said I was a traitor to my own kind." Ayanna knelt down to his level, her large frame somehow gentle. "You're no traitor, Samuel. You're the bravest person I know." She looked up at Tom. "Can he stay here? Just until things settle down?" Tom nodded without hesitation. "We've got room. Could use the help around the ranch anyway." As they walked back to the house together, this strange, makeshift family of broken people, Ayanna felt something shifting in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope, like belonging, like maybe the word home could mean something again. The battle wasn't over. There would still be a trial, still be people who wanted her, caged or dead, still be scars that would never fully heal. But for the first time in 4 years, Ayanna believed she might actually survive. Not just exist, not just endure, but truly live. And that belief, fragile as a bird's egg, but precious as gold, was worth fighting for. The 3 weeks before the trial passed in a strange rhythm of domesticity, punctuated by dread. Ayanna learned the routines of ranch life, waking before dawn to help Tom with the cattle, discovering that physical labor helped quiet the anxious voices in her head. Samuel proved himself invaluable, his small hands quick with rope work, and his cheerful chatter, filling silences that might otherwise have grown oppressive. At night, the three of them sat around the kitchen table while Tom taught Samuel to read from old newspapers, and Ayanna taught them both Apache words. The boy absorbed language like desert sand, soaking up rain, his young mind flexible in ways adult minds could never match. "You're good with him," Tom observed one evening after Samuel had fallen asleep on the couch, his sketchpad still clutched in one hand. Ayanna looked at the sleeping child, his face peaceful in a way it never was when awake. "He reminds me of what I lost, but also of what might still be possible." Tom poured coffee for both of them, the domestic gesture so natural now that Ayanna barely noticed when it happened. "The lawyers are coming tomorrow, Eleanor's team from Albuquerque. We need to prepare you for what they're going to ask." Ayanna's hands tightened around her cup. "I know. They'll want me to relive every moment, every detail of what Hargrove did, what I did in return." "It's going to be hard," Tom said quietly, "but it's necessary. The jury needs to understand what really happened that night." She looked at him across the table, this man who'd bought her freedom with everything he owned. In the flickering lamplight, she could see the silver threading through his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. "When did you become so wise about white man's law?" Tom's smile was rueful. "When I realized that the law is the only weapon we have that might actually work. Nietzsche's warriors scared off the mob, but guns only buy time. Paper and precedent, those things last." A sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats approaching slowly, carefully. Tom moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that now lived beside the door. "One rider," he said, coming up the main road, not trying to hide. Ayanna joined him at the window, her height giving her a better view over his shoulder. The rider materialized from the darkness, and she felt her breath catch. It was a woman riding astride like a man, her long skirts hiked up practically. As she came closer, lamplight revealed a face Ayanna had seen before in the square, though never this close. "That's Martha Henderson," Tom said, surprise evident in his voice. "The banker's wife. She was one of the loudest voices demanding you stay locked up." Ayanna remembered the woman's shrill accusations, her finger pointing, while she declared Ayanna unnatural and ungodly. What does she want now? Tom opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the porch with the rifle held low but ready. "Mrs. Henderson, it's late for visiting." Martha Henderson dismounted with practiced ease, tying her horse to the porch rail before approaching. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. "Mr. Brennan, Miss Ayanna, I need to speak with you. Please, it's important." Tom glanced at Ayanna, who nodded slightly. They stepped aside to let the woman enter. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her hands twisting her riding gloves into knots, clearly struggling with whatever she'd come to say. "I've come to apologize," Martha said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And to offer testimony for your trial." Ayanna stared at her. "You were the one who called me a thing, who said I wasn't fit to live among civilized people." Martha's face crumpled. I know what I said, and I was wrong, so terribly wrong." She sank into a chair uninvited, her composure cracking. "My daughter Susie. She's been having nightmares ever since that day in the square, the day she saw you in the cage. She wakes up screaming, saying the sad lady is calling for help, saying someone needs to save the sad lady." Tears streamed down Martha's face now. "At first I thought she was just being fanciful. Children have nightmares. But 3 nights ago, she asked me a question that I couldn't answer. She asked me, 'Mama, if Jesus says to love everyone, why do we hate the Apache lady?'" "What did she do that was so bad?" The woman's voice broke. "And I couldn't answer her. Couldn't tell my 6-year-old daughter why I'd been so full of hate for a woman I didn't even know. Couldn't explain why I believed every lie they told about you without ever asking for your side of the story." Ayanna remained standing, arms crossed, her face impassive. So your daughter's conscience made you uncomfortable. That's why you're here. No, Martha said, looking up at her. I'm here because I went to see Eleanor Hargrove, asked her to tell me the truth about what happened. And she did. She told me everything. About her son's letters, about the complaints other soldiers made, about what he tried to do to your sister. She stood up facing Ayanna directly, despite having to crane her neck to meet her eyes. I'm here because I spent 3 years throwing stones at an innocent woman, and I want to stand up in that courtroom and tell the jury that I was wrong, that this town was wrong, that you deserve justice, not persecution. Tom spoke up. You realize what you're risking, the social cost of testifying on her behalf. Martha's jaw set with determination. I don't care. My daughter asked me a simple question, and it made me see what I'd become. What we'd all become, a town so afraid of difference that we caged a woman for defending a child. She turned back to Ayanna. I can't undo what I said, can't take back the stones I threw or the names I called you, but I can tell the truth now, if you'll let me. Ayanna studied the woman for a long moment, searching her face for deception. But all she saw was genuine remorse and desperate need for redemption. She recognized that look. She saw it every time she looked at Tom. Why should I trust you? Ayanna asked. How do I know this isn't some trick to get me to lower my guard? You don't, Martha admitted. You have no reason to trust me. But I'm going to testify regardless of whether you want me to or not. Because my daughter is watching to see what her mother does when she realizes she's been wrong. And I want to teach her that admitting mistakes and trying to fix them is more important than protecting pride. The simple honesty of it, the complete lack of self-justification, reminded Ayanna of the way Tom had confessed his own crimes. These broken white people stumbling toward redemption through honesty and sacrifice. Then testify, Ayanna said quietly. Tell them whatever truth you've found. After Martha left, Tom and Ayanna sat in silence for a long time. Samuel had woken during the conversation and was now sitting on the stairs, his young face thoughtful. Does everyone get a chance to be forgiven? The boy asked. Even people who do really bad things. Ayanna thought about Tom burning her village, about herself killing Hargrove, about Martha Henderson throwing stones, about all the ways people hurt each other and then had to live with what they'd done. I don't know about forgiveness, she said finally. But I think everyone gets a chance to try being better than they were. Whether they take that chance is up to them. The lawyers arrived the next morning in a dusty carriage pulled by expensive horses. There were 3 of them, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Crawford, who made it immediately clear that she hadn't traveled from Albuquerque to lose a case. She set up her papers on Tom's kitchen table and got straight to business. Tell me everything, she said to Ayanna. Start from the day the soldiers came to your village and don't leave anything out. I need to know every detail, no matter how painful or embarrassing. For 6 hours, Ayanna talked. She described the raid on Sierra Blanca, watching her grandmother burn while she ran with the children. She described Hargrove capturing them, the forced marriage, the 3 years of abuse disguised as legal matrimony. She described the night he came for Nayeli, the sound of her sister screaming, the feeling of her fist connecting with his jaw. Margaret took notes without flinching, her pen scratching steadily across paper. When Ayanna finished hoarse from talking, the lawyer looked up with eyes that held both sympathy and calculation. It's a strong defense, Margaret said. Self-defense and defense of others. But the prosecution is going to argue that your size and strength meant you used excessive force. They'll say a woman your size hitting a normal man is tantamount to using a deadly weapon. Ayanna felt her stomach sink. So my body itself is a crime. Not a crime, Margaret corrected, but a complicating factor. We need to prove that you had no intention of killing Hargrove, that his death was accidental, that you were acting in the moment to stop an imminent threat. She flipped through her notes. We have Samuel's drawings showing Hargrove attacking Nayeli. We have Eleanor Hargrove's confession about her son's history of abuse. We have testimony from other soldiers about complaints that were filed and ignored. And now we have Martha Henderson willing to testify about the town's prejudice against you. What we don't have," one of the other lawyers chimed in, "is any testimony about your character, about who you were before all this happened." Tom spoke up. "What about other Apache? People who knew her in her village. Most of them are dead or on reservations," Ayanna said quietly. "The ones who survived Sierra Blanca were scattered. I don't know where they are." Margaret tapped her pen thoughtfully. "What about Naiche and his warriors? They came to your defense. Would any of them testify?" Ayanna shook her head. "Apache warriors don't trust white man's courts, and asking them to come to Albuquerque would be asking them to walk into a trap. The Army would love an excuse to arrest them. Then we work with what we have," Margaret said decisively. "We'll put you on the stand. Let the jury see you as a person, not a monster. Let them hear your voice, see your humanity." The thought of standing in front of a room full of white people, being judged and examined like a specimen, made Ayanna's skin crawl. But she nodded. "If that's what it takes." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret drilled her relentlessly: how to sit, how to speak, how to answer questions without appearing defensive or aggressive, how to be small and non-threatening despite being nearly 6.5 feet tall. "You need to cry," Margaret said during one particularly brutal practice session. "When you describe your daughter's death, when you talk about Hargrove attacking Nayeli, the jury needs to see emotion, needs to see that you're human." "I don't cry on command," Ayanna said coldly. "Then think about something that makes you cry," Margaret pressed. "Think about Itzley, about your grandmother, about all you've lost." Ayanna stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You want to use my grief as a performance. Want me to parade my pain for white people's entertainment. I want you to stay out of prison," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "I want that jury to see past your size and your race and your reputation to the terrified mother who struck out to save her sister. And if that requires you to show vulnerability instead of strength, then yes, that's what I want." The two women stared at each other, wills clashing across the kitchen table. Tom intervened carefully. "Maybe we take a break. This is a lot for one day." But Ayanna knew Margaret was right, even if the truth felt like swallowing broken glass. She'd have to perform, have to play the role of the sympathetic victim rather than the strong survivor, have to make herself smaller and weaker to fit white people's expectations of what an innocent woman should look like. The night before they were to leave for Albuquerque, Ayanna couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, watching stars wheel slowly across the sky, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Tom found her there sometime past midnight. "Can't sleep either," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. They sat in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that had become comfortable over the past month. Ayanna had grown used to his presence, used to the way he moved through space carefully around her, always giving her room, always asking before assuming. "Tom," she said finally, "what happens if I'm convicted? If the jury decides I'm guilty after all?" "Then we appeal," Tom said immediately. "Take it to higher courts, fight until there's no fight left. And if that doesn't work," he was quiet for a moment, "then I'll find a way to get you out, even if it means breaking the law myself." The fierce loyalty in his voice made something warm bloom in Ayanna's chest. "You'd become an outlaw for me. I'd become whatever you needed me to be," Tom said simply. "That's what this has been about from the beginning, paying my debt, making things right." Ayanna turned to look at him in the starlight. "Is that all this is? A debt being paid?" Tom met her gaze, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. Something that went beyond guilt and obligation. "Started that way," he admitted. "But somewhere along the line it became something else." "What?" Ayanna asked, her heart suddenly hammering. "It became about wanting you to be happy," Tom said quietly. "About caring whether you smile or not. About lying awake at night thinking about ways to make your life better, not because I owe you, but because seeing you in pain hurts me too." He looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I know that's not what you signed up for. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, protection, in exchange for a name. But Ayanna, I need you to know that regardless of what happens in that courtroom, regardless of whether you stay or go after, this is over. These weeks with you have been the best of my life." Ayanna felt tears burning behind her eyes. The walls she'd built around her heart, the ones that had kept her surviving but not living, began to crack in earnest. She reached out and took Tom's hand, her large fingers engulfing his. "I can't love you," she said, and felt him tense. "Not yet, maybe not ever. The man who killed my daughter will always be part of who you are." "I know," Tom said, his voice rough. But Ayanna continued squeezing his hand. "I can trust you and respect you, and be grateful that in a world full of people who saw me as less than human, you saw me as someone worth saving." She paused, gathering courage. "And maybe given time that could grow into something more. If you're patient, if you can live with uncertainty." Tom's smile was sad but genuine. "I've already lived with worse than uncertainty. I can wait. I can wait as long as it takes." They sat holding hands on the porch until dawn painted the eastern sky with gold and pink. When Samuel emerged sleepy-eyed from the house, he found them like that and grinned with the knowing wisdom of children who see what adults try to hide. "You two look like the couples in my ma's romance books," he announced cheerfully. And just like that, the moment broke into laughter, nervous and relieved, and somehow exactly what they all needed before facing the trial that would determine everything. The courthouse in Albuquerque was imposing, all stone columns and marble floors designed to make people feel small in the face of justice. Ayanna walked through the doors, flanked by Tom and Margaret, with Samuel trailing behind, carrying the box of evidence and drawings. The courtroom itself was packed. News of the trial had spread throughout the territory, drawing curious onlookers and newspaper reporters hungry for a sensational story. Ayanna saw faces she recognized from Santa Rosa, some hostile, some curious, a few cautiously sympathetic. Eleanor Hargrove sat in the front row, her frail body supported by cushions, her eyes sharp despite her illness. Martha Henderson sat beside her, chin raised defiantly, even as other townspeople glared at her betrayal of white solidarity. The prosecution's table held 3 lawyers in expensive suits, backed by money from the Hargrove cousins in Boston who wanted vindication for their family name. They looked at Ayanna with cold calculation, seeing not a person but a problem to be solved. "All rise," the bailiff called, the Honorable Judge Samuel Carter presiding. The judge was an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, or so Margaret had assured her. He took his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with evident displeasure. "This court is here to determine facts, not to provide entertainment," he announced. "I will tolerate no outbursts, no demonstrations, no attempts to influence the jury through intimidation. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution painted Ayanna as a dangerous savage who'd manipulated a vulnerable white officer, married him under false pretenses, and then murdered him in cold blood when he'd outlived his usefulness. They emphasized her size, her strength, the brutal efficiency of the killing. Margaret's opening was different. She spoke quietly, making the jury lean in to hear. "This is not a story about a savage," she said. "This is a story about a mother who lost everything, a woman who watched her child burn, who was forced into marriage with the man who destroyed her family, who endured years of abuse before finally desperately striking back when that same man reached for another innocent child." She gestured to Ayanna. "Look at her. Yes, she's tall. Yes, she's strong. But strength doesn't make you guilty. Size doesn't make you a murderer. And being Apache doesn't mean you deserve less justice than anyone else in this room." The first week of trial was brutal. The prosecution called witness after witness, testifying to Ayanna's intimidating presence, her sullen silence during her captivity, the violence of Hargrove's death. They painted a picture of calculated revenge dressed up as defense. But Margaret was relentless in cross-examination. She forced them to admit that Ayanna had never been violent before that night, that she'd never threatened anyone despite having the physical capability to harm, that the only time she'd raised her hand to Hargrove was when he was attacking Nayeli. When Samuel took the stand, the courtroom went silent. The boy held up his drawings one by one, explaining in a clear, steady voice what he'd witnessed that night. The prosecution tried to discredit him, suggesting a child's imagination had embellished reality. But Samuel refused to be shaken. "I know what I saw," he said firmly, "and I drew it exactly how it happened because I thought someday someone would want to know the truth." Eleanor Hargrove's testimony was devastating to the prosecution. Frail and dying, she commanded the courtroom with aristocratic authority. As she detailed her son's history of abuse, she read excerpts from his letters, each one more damning than the last. "My son was a monster," she concluded, her voice breaking, "and I enabled him by staying silent. But I won't be silent anymore. Ayanna killed him to save a child from rape. If that makes her a murderer, then the law itself is guilty." Martha Henderson testified about the town's prejudice, about how they'd all been willing to believe the worst about Ayanna without evidence simply because she was Apache. Her honesty about her own complicity made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. And then it was Ayanna's turn. Margaret had coached her extensively, but all that preparation fled the moment Ayanna sat in the witness box and saw 12 white faces staring at her with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility. "State your name for the record," the clerk said. "Ayanna," she said, then added with defiant pride, "daughter of she who walks with morning stars, of the Chiricahua Apache, wife of Thomas Brennan." Margaret began with gentle questions, establishing Ayanna's life before the raid. She described her childhood, her marriage to her first husband, the birth of Itzley. Her voice remained steady until Margaret asked about the morning the soldiers came. "I was grinding corn," Ayanna said, and the steadiness cracked. "Itzley was playing nearby, making patterns in the dirt with a stick. She was singing. She always sang while she played." The memory opened like a wound. "My grandmother called out a warning. We heard horses, many horses. I grabbed Itzley and started running for the rocks. But there was so much smoke, the soldiers were burning everything." Tears began streaming down her face, now unstoppable, despite every lesson about control. "I looked back for my grandmother, saw the tent collapse, saw the flames, and I knew she was gone." "Tell the jury what happened to Itzley," Margaret said gently. Ayanna's voice broke completely. "I was carrying her, running. She was so scared, crying for her grandmother. I kept telling her it would be okay, that Mama would keep her safe." She paused, unable to continue for a moment. "Then I tripped, fell. Itzley rolled away from me. By the time I got up, the soldiers were everywhere. I couldn't find her, couldn't see through the smoke. I heard her screaming my name, but I couldn't reach her." The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the hostile faces softened slightly. "Later, after they'd rounded us up, after they'd counted the dead, they told me a child had burned in one of the tents," Ayanna continued. "They said she probably suffocated before the fire reached her. They said that to comfort me." She looked directly at the jury. "My daughter burned alive while I ran to save myself. And the man who held the torch that started that fire, the man who killed my Itzley, is the same man who married me a year later, who bought my freedom and tried to help me survive." A murmur went through the courtroom. Tom sat frozen in his seat, his face pale. The prosecution objected immediately. "This testimony is irrelevant to the case at hand," but Judge Carter overruled them. "The witness's state of mind and history with the deceased's killer is relevant context. Continue, Mrs. Brennan." Ayanna told the rest of it then. The forced marriage, Hargrove's drinking, the abuse she endured because she had nowhere to go and no one to protect her. And finally, that last night when he'd come for Nayeli, "I didn't think," she said. "I just acted. One moment he was reaching for my sister, and the next moment I was hitting him, not to kill, just to stop him, to make him leave her alone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, wondered if I could have done something different, pushed him instead of striking him, called for help instead of taking action myself. But in that moment, all I knew was that I couldn't let him hurt another child, couldn't fail to protect someone I loved. Not again. She looked at the jury with raw honesty. So yes, I killed Lieutenant Hargrove, but I didn't murder him. I stopped him. And I'd do it again if faced with the same choice, because letting a child be harmed to save myself from consequences isn't something I could live with. The cross-examination was brutal. The prosecution hammered at her size, her strength, suggesting she could have restrained Hargrove without striking him. They pointed out that she didn't scream for help, didn't try to run with Nayeli, chose violence as her first response. But Ayanna held firm. When you've lived through watching your child burn while you failed to save her, she said quietly, you don't hesitate when given a second chance to protect someone. You act, you fight, you do whatever it takes. The prosecution had no response to that. Closing arguments lasted 2 days. The prosecution demanded justice for a murdered officer, claiming that allowing Ayanna to walk free would send a message that Indians could kill whites with impunity. Margaret countered that convicting Ayanna would prove that white men could abuse Apache women without consequence, that the law protected predators over victims. The jury deliberated for 3 agonizing days. Ayanna spent them at the hotel with Tom and Samuel, unable to eat, barely able to sleep. She walked the floor of their room like a caged animal, the irony not lost on her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. They filed back into the courtroom, Ayanna between Tom and Margaret. Her legs felt like water, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Carter asked. The foreman stood, a middle-aged rancher with weathered hands and honest eyes. We have, Your Honor. In the case of the Territory of New Mexico versus Ayanna Brennan on the charge of murder in the 1st degree, how do you find? The foreman looked directly at Ayanna. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted, some cheering, some cursing, reporters scrambling to file their stories. Ayanna stood frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. Tom grabbed her hand, tears streaming down his face. You're free, really free, not just out of the cage, but innocent. Cleared. Margaret was grinning fiercely. The jury found it was justified self-defense. You're completely exonerated. Ayanna sank into her chair as her legs gave out. Samuel threw himself at her, hugging her waist. Eleanor Hargrove smiled from her seat in the front row, looking satisfied despite her pain. Judge Carter banged his gavel for order. Furthermore, he announced when the noise died down, this court finds that Lieutenant William Hargrove's actions constituted assault with intent to commit rape of a minor. His death, while tragic, was the direct result of his own criminal conduct. He fixed Ayanna with a stern but not unkind gaze. Mrs. Brennan, you're free to go. I hope you find peace. They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt brighter than any Ayanna had ever seen. Free. Not just released on a technicality, but vindicated. Declared innocent by a jury of white men who'd actually listened to the truth. On the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed them with questions. Tom fielded most of them, while Ayanna stood stunned and silent. But one question cut through the noise. Mrs. Brennan, a young reporter, called out, Now that you're free, what will you do? Ayanna looked at Tom standing beside her, at Samuel clutching her hand at the open sky stretching endlessly above them. She thought about the cage she'd left behind and the future that suddenly seemed possible. I'm going home, she said simply. And for the first time since that day at Sierra Blanca, she meant it. The journey back to the ranch took 2 days. They traveled slowly, stopping to camp under stars that seemed to shine brighter now that the weight of pending conviction had lifted. Around the campfire, Samuel asked questions about Apache life, and Ayanna found herself sharing stories she thought were lost forever. When they finally crested the hill overlooking Tom's ranch, Ayanna felt something settle in her chest. This place, with its modest house and weathered barn and endless sky, had become home in the way her village once was. Not because it erased the past, but because it offered a different kind of future. That night, after Samuel had gone to bed, Ayanna found Tom on the porch again. Their spot, where they'd had their first real conversation, where they'd held hands before the trial, where all their most honest words had been spoken. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what Tom asked, for seeing me when everyone else saw a monster, for standing beside me when it would have been easier to walk away, for being patient when I couldn't give you what you wanted." She sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. The trial changed something, made me realize that carrying hate takes more energy than I have left, made me understand that you burning my village doesn't define our whole story, just the beginning of it. Tom looked at her, hope and fear warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm tired of being alone," Ayanna said. "Tired of punishing both of us for crimes we committed out of pain and desperation. I'm saying that maybe we could try being happy. Not because we deserve it, but because choosing to be miserable forever doesn't honor anyone's memory." She took his hand, the gesture natural now after weeks of practice. "I'm saying that when I told that reporter I was going home, I wasn't just talking about a place, I was talking about you." Tom's breath caught. "Ayanna, I don't deserve that." "None of us deserve the grace we're given," she said, "but we can choose to accept it anyway." He pulled her close then, and she let him, her tall frame folding into his embrace. They sat like that under the stars, two broken people who'd found a way to be whole together, proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best ones if we're brave enough to keep trying. Inside, Samuel watched from the window and smiled already, planning the drawing he'd make of this moment. A man and a woman on a porch, no longer separated by guilt and grief, finally choosing to be something other than their worst mistakes. And in the morning, when Ayanna woke in Tom's arms for the first time, she sang the old songs without sorrow. Songs of renewal, of spring after winter, of flowers blooming eternal even in the hardest soil. The cage was behind her, the trial was over, and the rest of her life stretched ahead full of possibility she'd thought was lost forever. She was Ayanna, eternal blossom, survivor, wife, and finally, blessedly free. Epilogue. 3 years later, the ranch had grown, not just in cattle or acreage, but in the kind of life that filled empty spaces with laughter and purpose. Samuel, now 13, rode the fence line with the confidence of someone who'd found his place. His sketch pad still accompanied him everywhere, but now it captured happier scenes, Ayanna teaching Apache words to the 3 orphaned children she and Tom had taken in Tom, repairing the barn with his crooked grin, the sunrise over the mountains that had become their shared horizon. Martha Henderson visited monthly, now her daughter Susie trailing behind with gifts of bread and awkward apologies that were no longer necessary. The town had changed slowly, grudgingly, but it had changed. Even Sergeant Miller, who once collected admission to watch her suffer, had quietly left for a new post at Fort Stanton, his shame too heavy to carry in Santa Rosa. Eleanor Hargrove had died the winter after the trial, peaceful in her sleep at the ranch. Ayanna had sung the Apache death songs over her grave, a gesture of forgiveness that Tom said would have meant more to Eleanor than any Christian prayer. Mayor Whitman had indeed worked the ranch for 6 months, not a full year, but long enough to learn that Apache justice was about restoration, not revenge. He'd left humbler, quieter, and never spoke against Ayanna again. And Ayanna herself. She stood on the porch now, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, 5 months along. A miracle, the doctor said, shouldn't be possible after everything her body had endured. But miracles, she'd learned, happened to those brave enough to hope for them. Tom joined her, slipping his hand into hers, still patient, still steady, Still the man who'd seen her when she was invisible. "What should we name her?" he asked. They both knew it would be a girl. Ayanna smiled, watching the children play in the yard, watching Samuel teach them how to track rabbits in the dust. "Itzli," she said. "Her name will be Itzli, so that my daughter's name is spoken with joy again." Tom kissed her hand. Eternal blossom and eternal memory, both blooming in the same garden. And for the first time since that November morning in 1874, Ayanna felt the cage around her heart finally completely break open.